So, friends, it's my privilege to introduce to you Gary Gunderson, Dr. Gary Gunderson. Gary, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, great to be here.
You live in Winston-Salem, but right now you're out in San Francisco, right?
Yeah, I'm actually my daughter's a playwright in San Francisco. My two grandsons are here, so I'm out with her, but actually standing at my daughter's desk, which is pretty cool for a dad.
And you have a connection to my daughter, who's a pastor in Winston-Salem.
She's my pastor at Green Street. Yes.
You'll agree, she's the best in her family.
Well, I wouldn't say that talking to you, but I'm not surprised she's as good as she is.
She is amazing. We got and your position, you teach up at Wake Forest. And
yeah, I actually am a professor at the School of Divinity, and I'm a professor in public health science. But my day job is vice president for Faith Health, and it's one word, not two words, and really, really important that there's an intellectual reason for that, but there's a very practical reason for that. That faith is not just an additive function; it's absolutely integral. When you talk about whether it's a broken elbow or a broken heart, faith is integral.
Absolutely. Our church got acquainted with you. We read your great book, Leading Causes of Life. So I want to talk to you about, I want to get around to some public health and your Carter Center work and congregational health, but really want to start with talking about Jesus and mental health. And let me just tee it up by saying, at points during my ministry, I thought, man, Jesus is a problem for mental health. Because I run into people all the time who, if I just pray, if I just trust God, if I have enough faith, or can you just give me a Bible verse? And this harms mental health, if anything, right? So just some basics about it. Jesus, he seems to heal everybody. So then people say, well, he hasn't healed me. I'm still depressed. What's that? Talk about that.
You know, Jesus is a problem for any 21st century highly educated American. Jesus is a big problem because he crosses the boundaries, not accidentally, but on purpose, between all of the things that we have different professionals for. So we have social workers and behavioral health specialists, and we have pastors, and we have surgeons. Jesus moved across all those boundaries and saw them as one seamless human reality. So the things we call mental are not just mental, but the body doesn't exist apart from the mind and the spirit. So Jesus moved, walked, and seamlessly connected all the things that we find disconnected.
And he sees people with physical maladies and says surprising things like your sins are forgiven. And then physically they're right. So,
and a lot of that language we find offensive. Why are you talking about sin? I mean, we're in a hypersensitive public moment where you can't say anything pejorative about anything. And here we are stuck with this Jesus talking about sin. Well, public health has a whole body of thought about wicked problems that are almost infinitely complex. And one time, one of my public health friends apologized. He said, "Oh, these are wicked problems." I said, "But I don't mean to imply, anything religious about it." And I said, "Well, of course you should. The wickedness that is the public and private reality for us today, even exacerbated by COVID, is the interweaving between long-term relational patterns that in and of themselves create profound traumas that we think of as mental health problems or behavioral health challenges. They're actually oftentimes embedded not in something broken inside our biomedical bodies, but actually are based in relationships, often with multi-generational traumatic overhangs. So Jesus, he's a problem.
You're talking about the generational thing. Our church did a series a few years back called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. This guy named Pete Scazzaro came down, and He uses the image of the iceberg, that sort of the life as we experience it. It's just the tip of the iceberg. It's all that deep stuff, which Jesus seems keenly interested in. One of the things that he talked in that series, you do a genogram, right? So you kind of trace your family and where was their alcoholism, where was their workaholism, where was their violence, where was their divorce. And the point being, sort of, we drag all these people in the room with us. I love just the title, though. Emotionally healthy spirituality implies there are emotionally unhealthy spiritualities.
Yes, and as I find myself somewhat surprised now to be an older person, I've always had sort of a teenage brain. I find that parts of my own history become evident to me as they're not left behind. In some ways, things that I experienced very young and parts of my family patterns that I wasn't even conscious of, not in my teens, not in my 20s, not in my 30s. I'm now 70, and I'm very frequently in my day, I'm aware of something that happened in my life that now I have a perspective to understand that there was a lot more going on in that experience than I had any capacity to know then. And now I find myself wanting to understand my own life whole. And I guess that maybe a few moments before I die, I'll be emotionally healthy.
I think it's in Middlemarch. George Eliot has a line of "Nothing would be a lesson to us if it didn't come too late," which is a pretty good line.
That's nice.
But how does Jesus help with our? I recently I read. I know it was in Richard Powers' novel Bewilderment, and he has a child that's got some major issues, and the teacher at school says, "Your child's on the spectrum," and he says, "Everybody's on the spectrum, right?" So all of us have stuff that goes on. How does Jesus help? There's this ad campaign out now. These commercials come and it says, "He gets us." So it's got Jesus. Jesus suffered anxiety. Jesus. How does Jesus help us?
I think Jesus helps us by keeping in view the parts that we don't know how to talk about. And very frequently we will move into the presence of Jesus thinking that we control the relationship. So I'm going to pray about this and I'm going to come to this church, not that church, because that church bothers me, and but the idea that we're in control of our own spiritual reality and that we're in control of the relationship with Jesus, a living Jesus blows apart our sense of control. We may think we're going to talk about some educational issue and it triggers what really is a deep emotional trauma. We may think we're going to, so the hospital, I work for a hospital, Atrium Wake, and we may think we're here to talk about diabetes, and because we have programs for diabetes. Well, Jesus takes a diabetes program and flips it into why we eat the way we eat, why we move the way we do, why we're afraid to go out, why our fears. Jesus keeps every issue whole and simply does not permit us to bifurcate into convenient professional channels. However, really important, I worked at the Carter Center for some of my formative years in faith health, and our office was next to Mrs. Carter's mental health program. And we could not possibly, there was no issue that we wanted to work with faith health that we were not thoughtful about the mental health side of it. And every year, Mrs. Carter would convene the major mental health tribes, plural, from around the country. Well, there are about 45 or 60 different professional groups just inside mental health. And they tended not to talk to each other very much, much less be part of the much broader array of what we think are the health sciences. So, I mean, what I learned with Mrs. Carter is the first word. One time I helped write a speech for her and she came back and toughened it. She said, the first word that any church should say in the context of mental health is a word of apology, that the church has been often the most powerful bastion of the worst stigmas, the most damaging silences in all of society. And how on earth a social body called church, following in the pathway of Jesus, managed to be the bastion of silence around behavioral health? That there's a mystery all by itself.
Yeah, we kicked off a mental health series a few years back. We pointed out that, if somebody has colon cancer, church really rallies to that. They do bumper stickers and they weave, blankets and deliver casseroles. But if somebody says, I'm bipolar, or we had a mom in our church, she suffered terrible postpartum depression, and people just froze, couldn't speak to her, didn't know what to do. And the church ought to be the place where you, if nowhere else, you can bleed all over the floor. Churches probably vary. I know I served a church years ago where people could say anything, but more churches have this kind of politeness, like almost as if, if you're close to God, you're good, you're smiling, you're fine. It's just criminal. Churches ought to be like the safest haven possible. Jesus doesn't give any sense of, come to me if you're fine. Come to me if you're happy. Come to me. It's come to me if you're broken, if you're weary.
Well, that's what we're seeing in real time. So we're having a conversation in what I pray are the later phases of the COVID phenomenon as that virus sort of becomes like the flu in our life. Still going to kill a lot of people for years to come, but maybe not as absolutely defining of our reality as it is now. But as the high water of the viral flood recedes, it's going to be like any other great flood. And what it leaves behind is we can see the massive amount of trauma and wreckage in people's lives that are going to express, not as something you can give a vaccine for, but they're going to express in all these patterns of how we try to adapt to trauma and dislocation and disruption in our life that you could call mental health. But actually the church would betray Jesus if we just sort of send it off. You need some therapy. In fact, you need the full healing body of Christ for those of us who are wounded and find our lives in tatters because of the patterns of COVID. So our economy's been savaged. Our political life has been left in tatters. And every part of our social life has been disrupted. Well, our spiritual life has been pretty well torn apart too. And so the healing that must follow the intense phase of the COVID viral phenomenon is really going to focus on the psychosocial spiritual triad that we think of as mental health, but we'll miss it if we don't understand it's psychosocial spiritual. And the healing, I believe, can only happen in the social spaces that a really healthy congregation creates, not just for its members, but for those in the neighborhood that I think will be looking for, drawn to places where they can find healing and not just tolerance, but love and acceptance.
I heard somebody the other day say, an earthquake is a bad thing, but sometimes more damaging are the aftershocks, right? Yeah. So same thing coming out of the pandemic. I mean, that's so interesting. So is therapy enough? I mean, talk about that added dimension. I go to a secular, people say, I want to go to a religious counselor. That's usually like a bad idea, right? So how does faith fit into that, right? How does God fit into coming to real wholeness? I mean, go to therapists and they work on inner darkness or memories or whatever you're dealing with. How does faith matter?
So I'm vice president of Faith Health at what has been Wake Forest Baptist Health, now Atrium Wake Forest Baptist. And one critical component of our Faith Health office, we have chaplains, you'd expect we would. We also have 35 counseling centers across the state of North Carolina that have additional training. So these are all state licensed behavioral health providers, mostly marriage and family counselors. But we also have a 2-year residency program that trains our counselors in the spiritual dynamics that are very common. And what they're trained to look for is not another brand of pathology called faith, but actually the way in which a person's life probably has spiritual assets that they might not even think of as spiritual. They might not be Methodist. They might be Zoroastrian, but probably in 21st century, they're not anything. But they still have spiritual assets. And so in a therapeutic setting, you can, over a period of time, work with an individual. And, it's a beautiful and thoughtful process to have a really skilled therapist in your life. Well, we have trauma at population scale. There are not enough 50-minute hours to go around to get for everybody to get all the therapy we need to become the fully human person. But there are other ways in which the deep intelligence that comes out of faith-informed mental health professionals can help inform us in congregational life about how what we think of as mental health is part of the way we can strengthen all our ministries. So no matter what the ministry is, it probably can be strengthened when informed by some of the mental health intelligence from providers who understand spirituality.
And church people can do better than they think they can do, right? I've had people of administrative assistants in my lifetime who people come in to talk to the pastor and they don't get past the administrative assistant just because that person's a great listener, has a huge heart, is compassionate. Sometimes religious people think they need to say some little truism like "He always in a better place" or "God needed another." That inflicts more harm than does good. So, church people can do better at this than they think they can do, right?
Well, a congregation is the training ground for people to be healers when they're not in that sanctuary. And if we imagine what happens on the physical piece of land called church, we think of that as the training ground where we learn how to experience and then learn how to transmit and make real in other people's lives the healing that we experience in the presence of the body of Christ. So most of the healing done in the name of faith is done in every venue except the actual sanctuary and the physical piece of land called the congregation. So that's where we learn how to be healers. It's not where I think we come to be healed. And frankly, what we learn in I think in the practice of faith health is we heal by being healers. And I think when you look at the pattern of Jesus' walk through, imagine functioning in a time without vaccine or germ theory or any of the protective assets of 21st century modern medicine. Jesus walked an incredibly tough and traumatized time that was under the boot heel of a really vicious political environment filled with corruption and really venal leadership from the Roman Empire down to Pilate. Well, Jesus, he was walking on tough ground, tougher than any ground in Winston-Salem or Charlotte. And he moved and healed. And he formed a body of people who walked with him. And he expected them to move out and do more than he could possibly do. And he sent them out as healers, not as specialists, as healers.
And Jesus' healing, I've always thought it's not that he had some magical divine power so much as he was full of compassion. He was a listener. He thought about. We did a series also a couple of years ago on this ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and so then you learn, instead of saying to somebody, "What's wrong with you?" you ask, "What happened to you?" Jesus seems interested in what happened to you. He meets the woman at the well, right, and a lot has happened to her. So Jesus gets that. I mean, we get confused, don't we? We think that Jesus is about the forgiveness of sin, and then we misread everything that he says. So Jesus says, you know, are you guilty of adultery if you've even lusted in your heart? So we think he's saying lust is bad, but that's not what it's about. It's tapping into that inner state and seeing how that the damage that does. Jesus is somebody with all they say he has compassion, though the Greek terms, like his bowels turned in him. He aches for people. So, but a lot of it's just that he can embrace the unembraceable, right? He can touch the untouchable. He is himself creating community, and that itself is healing.
And then he hoped for the unhopable. One of the inconvenient parts of Jesus is he never seemed to give up on anybody that the community had given up on and the people themselves had given up on. Do you want to be healed? And no one thought I could be healed. What do you mean, do I want to be healed? Well, pick up your bed and go heal somebody else. And by the way, your sins are forgiven. I didn't think we were talking about healing. I thought you were talking about an orthopedic problem. So the inconvenience of Jesus has to stay inconvenient in our lives throughout our entire life. And the research around ACEs that began with Kaiser Permanente's data dive into its own patient records and found the shock of very long-term consequences of very early trauma. Well, we just haven't done the data dive about mid-career trauma. It has long-term consequences too. We haven't talked about the brutal consequences of people losing their jobs before they were ready to quit working. In COVID, the Great Resignation, millions and millions of us have found our quote career ended or disrupted or impossible or unpalatable. Well, there'll be decades-long consequences of those traumas too. But I'm intrigued by what we've come to call the leading causes of life, that there's as much science on the life side as there is on the pathology side. But there's something about our hyper-professionalized, provider-oriented world of the 20th and 21st centuries that we have tended to continue to elaborate pathological vocabulary to make more and more diseases alive in our mind. We actually need the intellectual work on the generative side of life. And so there are, very powerful early childhood generative experiences too. And there are midlife powerful generative experiences too. And I think the primary intellectual work of the church is to build on its strength as a generative space that never gives up on life, always works towards life. And I read Jesus as primarily not being just a healer, as if he was restoring something that was broken in the past, but he was an ever-creating generative healer. So to heal is to generate, not just to restore. And many of us, that's just as inconvenient. We sort of like our wounds. We like to be, we're sort of comfortable in them, and they justify all sorts of stuff that we don't do. And I think Jesus needs to be inconvenient for those of us who find solace in our wounds.
Just all those messages out there, like, control is good, and people pray to try to get some more control. But the basis of our faith is like control is a problem, right? All the message out there, be the best you can be. You deserve the. So these are all like need. I've got to be better versus being open to mercy, to tenderness, to community.
Well, Jesus, again, the inconvenience of Jesus is he never releases the wholeness of our experience. And that includes the wholeness of our trauma that we might want to leave in the past. He brings it right back into our present, including the self-afflicted traumas that we need to ask forgiveness for and claim forgiveness for. And he never releases the inconvenience of the future, that we're not dead yet. So we're expected to be still part of the emerging, generative, beloved community that, the reign of God that Jesus announced and held us accountable to being part of God's still creating presence in our life. So, yeah, this Jesus, he's a problem. Jesus is not going to be controlled.
A good problem. A good problem. Let me ask you one last thing. We've talked some about how congregations can be. You work in public health. We've just been through a lot of people probably haven't thought much about public health until the pandemic, where suddenly we have everybody names it, a public health crisis, vaccination, not pandemic, and so on. How did congregation make a difference in public health? So not just how does the individual get better, or how do the people I know and love get better, but how does a congregation have an impact on public health?
First, most important thing is pray for those in public roles, not just the hospitalists, but for the director of public health in our community, the public health nurses, folks doing contact tracing, folks doing the vaccine programs, folks who are just getting just a heck beat out of them for trying to protect the public that God so loves. So step number one, the church needs to be the source of strength and support and spiritual support for those in public service. Right. And at this point, I mean, that could be a political point, but I'm not making a political point. I'm making a spiritual point. Pray for those. Pray for those who are protecting us. And after the COVID ceases being the primary thing we're afraid of, pray for the folks who are working on, inspecting our restaurants and doing rat control and doing the 101 of pray for the people taking out the trash and making our cities safe for us. We have lionized the health workers who are the best known surgeons, but the ones who actually are responsible for the dramatic extension in normal life expectancy are the ones taking out the trash and doing the public health work. And we ought to raise them up in prayer and celebration every single week.
Wow. That's well said. Or even anytime we talk about faith and voting, people get nervous. But I was really struck the other day. My son's actually working on a campaign, and the guy he's working for, I heard him make a stump speech one day, and everything he's about is what are we going to do for the most vulnerable? And when he finished the speech, I was in awe. And I turned to my wife and said, he'll never get elected. But because we tend to vote for, what's going to help me. But part of the Christian thing, though, right, is we have this preference for those who are, Jesus did, for those who are most vulnerable, who don't have connections, who are not themselves empowered. They've been squashed down by the system. I mean, that's part of what we're called to be about, right? As followers of Jesus.
So during COVID, I found myself, I'm a writer, and I thought, well, can't leave the home. This is a good time to write a couple books. The book that actually came out of me, to my shock, was a book of prayers that was inspired by those of Walter Rauschenbusch 100-some years ago in the last great pandemic, when there was a broad movement called the Good News social gospel movement that essentially said the greatest expression of the spirituality rooted in Jesus, when you look at what Jesus talked about, it was all social expression. And that movement was political 110 years ago, but it was a movement undergirded by prayers. And so I found myself, well, we need new prayers. And so I ended up writing some prayers that are sort of borderline heretical. And maybe they're not borderline heretical, but at some time I'd love to talk about that. But the natural, untethered expression of coming into the presence of God and being liberated to hope for the whole world is is radical. So I don't know about this next election cycle. It's a little hard to see it being anything other than a dumpster fire. But 3 or 4 or 5 election cycles from now, I am just praying that God leads us into a public space where we can talk in public about the values that we would recognize as the good news of the gospel at population scale, public scale. And we've got to pray for public servants who can come into our lives and bring voice and policy to actually let that be the scaffolding on which we grow. But I'm literally humbled in prayer that we can find our way back to being the people that God would recognize.
I'd love to I'd love to pray those prayers. Jesus' prayers are pretty interesting, right? They verge on the heretical. He speaks of God abandoning him. And when he prays, it's not just, well, help me and my disciples to have a good day. But he really does. He feels the ache of the city of Jerusalem and how it's broken. He weeps over the city that's lost its way and so on. Praise the Psalms, which are brutally honest. They're communal in nature. That's what Jesus prayed. His mother taught him those when he was a little boy. Even on the cross, he calls on the Psalms. Good place for us to start. Yeah. Gary, this has been a great conversation. I know our people have been blessed by talking with you. So thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your work and your ministry. It's making a difference.
Thank you, James. Thanks for your daughter, by the way. She's my pastor.